Interview with Phyllis Hoskins, August 28, 1992, 650 East Strawbridge Avenue, Melbourne, Florida. Interviewer Nancy Yaseko. Cameraman Robert Gilbert. Equipment Sony BVP-50 camera. Beta SP recorder Sony BVW-35. Audio on channels 2 and 4. Copyright Brevard County Historical Commission 1992. Phyllis Hoskins, Tape 1.
Really?
Tell me when you were born and where, and what brought you to Brevard County.
Oh, you're Snoopy, aren't you? When was I born? In 1911 in California, and where my parents lived. And then my father had business in Chicago, so the family went, my brother and myself and my mother and father. And then he decided that it would be interesting to find out a little bit more about this coast. But he developed pneumonia, so it was a question of him actually being sent by the doctors to Florida for the climate. And that's how we became interested. My father became very interested in the landscape around.
Cut.
But my father was very, very interested in the area, and he snooped around and had people take him in boats across, because there were no bridges or anything at that point. And he purchased the property opposite Melbourne, and which there was Melbourne Beach that you obtained ground rights there, I guess, by boat. There used to be a little boat that ran from the harbor. But Daddy was fascinated with it, so he bought the property that was, and named it Indialantic, half Indian River and half Atlantic Ocean. So many people say, how did they get Indialantic? And I said, it's very simple. But it was very lovely, and my brother and I foraged the woods around the area after the bridge was not completed at that point. We lived over there when there was just a dock out in front of our house, but Daddy built the first little house on the river there, and then we went back and forth in a boat. But it was an interesting life, really, because other than the fact that I quarreled with my brother a lot, as normally would happen with a family, because we were confined and we were mad that we had nobody else to play with. But as time passed on and the development was more popular, and of course we went back to California to my grandparents' home every summer, which made it interesting. And then I just watched the development of the area, and then married a man who came to Kentucky Military Institute that used to winter in O'Galley. And so then a romance became apparent. So we just decided that Melbourne was a wonderful place to live. And we watched the development of it and the different things that started and failed and started and were successful. But it made an interesting life, and it's an interesting place. You have so many visitors that are wonderful.
Let's go back about a few things in the early days. When you first came down here, you stayed at a hotel?
Mm-hmm. There was I say that loosely. It was a building on the corner by the railroad tracks down here, where is the hardware store there now? I can't even remember what's there. But anyway, it was very, very loosely called downtown part, I guess. But it was my father who was the man that was instrumental in discovering how interesting the sea coast was, and in connection with mainland here.
And your house over on what was going to become Indialantic area, what was it like?
California, naturally, being from California, the little cottage that Daddy had built was very similar to that. But I can remember riding over on the boats that were carrying the lumber, and my father propping me up with my brother, taking some of the material over that was to be our home later on. But it was a varied sort of a childhood because we went back to California to my grandparents' house and had a little sophistication along the way to help it. But everybody that came here loved Melbourne. And so it was interesting to see it. And of course, I've lived here for so many years now. And I can recollect a few things, but some that were so sort of dim in my memory. I would imagine that I could think of a lot of other things, but I just,
Well,
no.
when you were living in Indialantic, where did you go to school?
Oh, over here. But we had a boat. You called them speedboats in those times, in those days. But it was just a little open boat. And my father, or my brother, not my brother, he was only 3 years older than I, but brought us over to the harbor. And then we walked, I've forgotten where the school was at that point. Somebody else perhaps would remember, but I don't. But it was accessible, apparently. So.
How many years did you take the boat to school? Was that something that went on for 2-3 years, or?
Well, my father, in the meantime, you see, had bought the property and then had started the construction of the bridge. So he built the first wooden bridge. That's why they've named it after him. Have you ever seen that name on the signs on the bridge? And I've always told all my friends, they say, how do you pronounce it? And I said, well, it's just like Kouwen-Hoven, except it's Kouwen-Hoven. So then they call me Miss Kouwen-Hoven the rest of my association with him.
What does the plaque say on the bridge?
They call it the Ernest Kouwen-Hoven Causeway. That's what's on that plaque. Somebody stole one of the metallic plaques, the one on the far side from town is remaining, and they just put a little wooden one up in replacement. But somebody dug up. It must have been somebody that had an ancestor that was the same name or something that they decided to take it. But wasn't that weird?
What did that first bridge look like?
Just like a wooden bridge.
Was there a way for boats to get through?
Oh yes, it had a draw, but the draw was manually controlled. And there was a man that lived in the little, what did we call the draw house? And he walked around cranking that part of the causeway so that the boats could go through. But the boat traffic, I guess, wasn't as heavy then as it is now. But it was interesting.
I bet it was. What was school like here? Can you recall? Was it a one-room schoolhouse or many rooms?
Well, I remember going down by the river at one time or another. There were just little schools. And of course, gradually, as it developed and the community developed, Melbourne developed bigger, they started building school buildings. But my brother and I, before the bridge was completed, came over here to a little school, so that our education was not lacking. We had Melbourne's best. But then we went to California, to Los Angeles, in Pasadena every summer, so I got a touch of culture then.
Well, there must have been a few plays or musical events that happened around here. Do you recall any?
In more recent years, of course, but not as far back as I was discussing.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't.
Has circus come to town ever?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Something like. Well, did the city have their own kind of holiday plans? There were things that.
Oh no.
No.
I'm talking about a much more primitive life than that. But it developed very rapidly, you know, as people settled. And there were many people, just like my father, when the doctor said, you have to get into a warmer climate, people come south. And it was one person, a word of mouth, they say, well, there's a little village in such and such part of Florida, go see that. That's the way it develops.
Were there doctors down here and
Oh, yes.
dentists?
Dr. Bean, I think, was our general practitioner, we'd call him. And Dr. Hicks, they used, don't know whether I should repeat this, but it was K. Hicks, it was, so it was I. Killam Hicks, I. Mendham, it was I. M. Hay, Dr. I. M. Hay. I fix them, and I've forgotten what, but the initials stood for something very humorous that the people used to say. But we had adequate attention. And then, of course, I can remember riding in a dirt road with my father up to Titusville because all of his business transactions and recordings, of course, of things was in Titusville. But
what was that road like?
Just ruts, but your cars were the kind that went into ruts and stayed. You didn't really need a driver. Started going and she'd go to Titusville and back. But it was crude living, but interesting.
Well, what would you do for fun?
Well, my brother liked it to say, he said, "Oh, so you want to play?" So we would box for a little while, and then I'd cry, and that was the end of that. But it was a little lonely for a little girl and a little boy. Of course, Jack went out hunting in Indialantic and things like that with his little shotgun. But it was actually treacherous because there were rattlesnakes along the paths around, so that I can remember Jack shooting several rattlesnakes. That's primitive enough, isn't it?
Yes, it is. What other sorts of things would he go hunting?
I wasn't that interested, I don't think, and I thought it was pretty gory.
Did y'all ever go fishing?
Oh, yes.
What sort of thing would you catch?
Trout and the same fish that are in the little waters out there now are just about the same kind. But it was really an interesting life. Of course, we went back to my grandparents' home in Pasadena every summer, so we became civilized for a while and had to wear shoes.
You didn't wear shoes?
Oh, yes, I did. But a lot of youngsters didn't. But I think their soles of their feet were hardened, but I couldn't. I was scared I'd step on something. So I usually kept my shoes on.
It's a good idea. I did see a picture from a schoolhouse up in Titusville, and almost all the kids had bare feet.
Mm-hmm.
Very different kind of thing.
I should say so. That was probably an old picture.
In the teens.
Mm-hmm.
In the teens. Well, let's see. What about mosquitoes? There must have been a few mosquitoes.
Something horrible. Yeah. Ghastly. But you had repellents, just like they have now, that you spray. You used to, before guests would come in our little house, you used to take a flit gun and spray the screen door before you open the door to let them in.
While they were standing there, you were spraying?
That's practically. Yeah, they'd stand back so that you could even open the door with it.
Oh, boy.
Sounds a little primitive, doesn't it? But it was a normal thing, I thought.
Did you ever go on any train rides? I know the railway
went to California every summer.
On the train?
Uh-huh. Went to Jacksonville, and then we changed. And I think it was a through train from Jacksonville in those days to Los Angeles.
What kind of business was your father in? You say he worked to build the bridge. Was he doing construction all around here?
No. It was just, as I said, he was sent down here because of his chest condition. And he just was a developer. Mm-hmm. And he bought the property, and then what his job was creating the sales, I guess, and selling the property individually, but it was plotted and platted, you know, just like regular real estate would be. So.
And then other people would buy the lots and build houses. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you look at it,
There were salesmen. Daddy had salesmen too that worked for Indialantic. I can remember that. But it's funny that you remember things up to a point, and then unless I had books, I unfortunately had every history book that I ever had about Indialantic, and they were wonderful recollections, and I loaned them to somebody, and that somebody, I did not write down who it was, and I have never gotten them back. So that's the tragic part of my story of Indialantic.
when you look over out your window today, you can see that development.
Oh, yes,
Do you ever imagine that one little house there?
Oh, constantly. Even when I drive across the causeway, my daughter lives in Indialantic, and the memories are very clear to me. But we used to fish. Daddy used to fish in the Banana River. It was a very apropos place to go because it was pretty and the fishing was good. I guess it still is.
As you got older, you got involved in a number of different things. I know you were known around here for a radio show.
Oh, yes. Well, I had a dear darling friend, Barbara Bancroft, who started it. And then she went in the real estate business and left me with it. So I continued it for quite a few years.
Tell us about that, what it was called and when it aired and what sort of guests you had on.
Oh, guests were anybody's visitors. You know, anybody 2 miles from home's an interview. But there were fascinating people who used to winter in Florida and in Melbourne and not Indialantic because it wasn't developed that much. But anytime anybody had a guest was a good occasion for an interview. But it was fun.
What was the name of your show?
Talk of the Town. And Barbara then went into the real estate business, became a very successful realtor, Barbara Bancroft, and left me on my own, and I've forgotten how long it lasted, but not long. It gets a little tiring to get constant guests every day, you know.
5 days a week you had
Uh-huh.
the show? It would broadcast in the mornings or afternoons?
It was morning.
And it was a live program?
Yes. We called it live. I don't know whether it kept people awake or not, but it was.
Yeah.
No recordings.
Well, that must have been with one of the first stations that came to Brevard. There weren't any radio stations here when you came.
Oh, no, I guess not. But of course, this was years after my father and mother came.
How else would the news get around? There were newspapers?
Oh, yes. I think the Melbourne Times was in existence then, in those days. And even coming from a place like California and living in a place like Pasadena, it didn't seem primitive to us. But looking back on it now, it was extremely primitive living. But you could have everything shipped in. No, we used to have, remember my grandmother sent box after box after box of candies and things and delicacies from California. So it's nice to have relatives out of the state.
This wasn't the sort of place you'd find delicacies downtown, I guess.
No, but things were shipped in individually. You would have things, of course, that were mailed to you, so.
What sort of businesses were there in town?
Oh, goodness gracious. It seemed to me that there were sufficient little dry goods stores and things like that, you know, so that you got supplies and constantly. I should have looked up, but as I say, if I had not lost all my paraphernalia, I could read out of the book to you a million different things, but whoever has all my histories, please bring them back.
What do you remember about the agriculture at that time? What?
Well, that was part of our life, was the fact that the people who had farms and groves, you see there were a lot of people who had started citrus groves. And but I can't think of any other industry or anything that would supply food to us or anything. Other than regular gardens that people had probably, and brought their things to town once a week.
There's an ice house in town, I guess, here in Melbourne. Y'all used ice boxes.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Did you go pick up the ice, or would they bring it across the bridge to?
I can't remember that. I don't remember anybody bringing it over. But we had ice chests instead of ice refrigerators. But everybody went to town once a day or twice a day, whether it be by boat or later days across the bridge. So in my recollection, it wasn't primitive at all, but it really was. Extremely primitive in comparison to the nice things that we have now, the shops and the advantages.
What would you do on Saturday or Sunday that was different than the other days?
I think Saturdays was always a night to howl for some reason or other, but it was just the usual things that families would do, and you'd go by boat wherever you wanted to go to visit people, or they'd come to see you by boat. And so it was seemed very normal to me.
Were there dances?
Oh, yes.
Local musical groups, or would they?
Local. Mm-hmm.
Local groups.
Can't remember the names particularly, but there was always a musician in the group that was willing to play.
Okay, good. Let's see. Do you have any particular memories of your school days? Any funny things that happened, or a teacher that sticks out in your mind as being extraordinary in one way or another?
Not really, because going to California so oftentimes and staying for part of the school year, you know.
So you didn't just go for short visits, you stayed
Oh, no.
a good piece of the year out there.
Oh, yeah, my grandparents' home was there.
Okay. Were you involved in Florida politics at all?
Oh, goodness. My husband was the manager of the Florida Power and Light Company here, and for years, and you can imagine the politics that would go on in the city, in the little city. It's always the same, but I never ran. He would never let me.
Did you want to run for an office?
Oh, I always had my 2 cents I put in anyway. But it was interesting to see it develop and see people who were sincerely interested in watching the growth. So I think they've done a very good job, don't you?
Yeah. I've heard some funny stories early on with different elections and things, that these were much earlier, when they would stuff the ballot boxes and I don't know what all.
Well, that would not that would have been on the mainland here.
That was on the
Melbourne.
mainland, and that was back, in the early 1800s, 1840s, 1850s.
I wasn't around then.
No.
Look, I came pretty soon.
Which, are there any particular Florida legislators that stand out in your mind as having been very instrumental for this area?
Well, just because I think that my husband was the manager of the Florida Power and Light Company, he was very, not ecumenical, but what you say, impartial about things, and had to be, so that I was taught to listen and be still.
Okay. What was this place like during the Depression? You would probably recall it as, or was it just so primitive you could hardly tell the difference?
Well, it really wasn't that primitive at any time. I didn't think, except when we lived over at the on the beach side without the bridge. That was a little primitive living, going back and forth by boat for supplies and things. But I can remember going up to Cocoa to get things that we couldn't have here. But Cocoa seemed to be a little more progressive as a city. And going in the car, whoever it was I was with, but the wheels fit right in the ruts of the road, so you could just sit back and I used to think that was fun to watch somebody in a little car that we followed the ruts around. But we got up to Cocoa, and I don't know exactly why. Somebody perhaps more aware of history would remember why Cocoa was more developed than we were.
Well, maybe the train got there first.
Well, Kentucky Military Institute had their winter quarters were in O'Galley, like O'Galley would be now, and that made for a much more sophisticated atmosphere of the people coming down from Kentucky with their school.
Well, there were a
And
lot
they
of
used to have dances in the O'Galley, old O'Galley. It was a two-story O'Galley Yacht Club. It used to be a two-story building on the mainland side. And the dances there were wonderful. Or the Melbourne Golf and Country Club had dances, and there were always seats around the side for all the visitors to sit in to watch a dance. But life went on like it does in most any community. Yeah. Everybody who was a foreigner, meaning, quote, out of the Florida realm of living, brought something good to our lives.
A lot of Northerners came down just for the winter.
Yes.
Where would they stay?
Well, there were several hotels around that they stayed, but there were a lot of people that took advantage of renting their homes at that time to people. You know, they'd take trips and
they'd leave.
They'd leave. But it was always accessible, a place to stay.
Did that change the character of the entertainment and the different things that were going on when all the Northerners were down, or was it?
Well, I wasn't really aware of it because I was a little young at that point. But because my life would not change any, but except that I went to California in the summer.
Right.
A little different.
What about during World War II? What was this area experiencing at that point?
Well, my feeling was that it was like a boom because we had the bases here, you know, and so much more activity. A little frightening, perhaps, but I was not aware of fear at that point. But it really was felt here because we had the Banana River Naval Air Station, and then there was the Melbourne base too. So that kept us on our toes, I guess.
Brought a lot more people.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes. There are probably residents today that came initially because of the war.
Okay, we're near the end of this tape. And let's cut. Interview with Phyllis Hoskins, August 28th, 1992, at 650 East Strawbridge Avenue, Melbourne, Florida. Interviewer Nancy Asecco, cameraman Robert Gilbert. Equipment Sony BVP50 camera, Sony BVW35 Beta SP recorder. Audio on channels 2 and 4. Copyright Brevard County Historical Commission 1992. Phyllis Hoskins, tape 2. Can you tell us about any of the storms or hurricanes that came through?
Well, we were always apprehensive, and we usually came, if we had enough warning, came to town. I think that everybody gathered in the old Melbourne Hotel and various places that were substantial that had lasted other prior to that. They knew it was a substantial building. But living at Indialantic, of course, my father would get us all across to the mainland to out weather the storm.
Do you remember how you knew a hurricane might be coming?
Well, we had communication, you know. We didn't have TV, unfortunately, back in those days. But it was just like any other communication that you had in those days. The telephones worked, but if the telephone wires went down, then you had no communication. But they got word to us. I mean, they were always, there was somebody who came to Indialantic where we were and in an isolated position. But there was enough warning usually that we'd get to town and make our arrangements, my parents would, to have some place that was substantial and safe. I think it used to be the old Melbourne Hotel.
Sounds right.
It was a building that lasted a long time, and people had bathing facilities and so forth and so on there, which made it livable, I guess. But I was so young that my brother and I'm sure, thought that everything was a lark. So it's hard to recall and go back and take a serious glance at the way life was.
Do you recall the winds blowing and
Oh, yes.
did you hear the building creaking or?
Well, our buildings were pretty substantial. Our little cottage at the beach was, I call it a cottage because it was one story. It wasn't a two-story building. But it survived many a storm. So we thought that it was substantial enough.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever see tree limbs?
Oh, yes. But it, as we say, it cleaned the neighborhood. Blew away the trash.
I guess that's the best thing you can say about a storm.
Right. But they were fearful because you never quite knew how substantial a building was that was near you or around. And being before the bridge was completed, of course it was terrifying when we were there. I remember just as a child, my mother was so worried about it. So I naturally assumed that worry too.
Right.
But I can remember that.
Yeah. You were talking about some of the transportation routes with the cars and the ruts. Did the ruts go two ways, or was there just one set of ruts?
No, one set of ruts, and then you had to pull off on the side. But the cars are so light and flimsy in those days, you know, they weren't substantial big cars like they are now, so that you could pull off easily just at the side.
Uh-huh. Did you ever get stuck in the sand?
Oh, indeed so. But there was always somebody who came along and took a shovel and plowed you out.
Sounds like a different life.
Atmosphere, yes.
A little more relaxed, I guess.
Oh, completely. And there were charming people who came down in the wintertime just like they do now. But there were several hotels, you see, that were around that people stayed. And then that's the way a lot of those winter tourists were the ones that are substantial citizens of the area now. So there are lots of people who have interesting stories to tell you. They have smarter brains than I. Their memories are better.
Okay, let's cut. Would you go to the beach to go swimming? Or?
Oh, yes. I can remember my mother going and sitting in the car, leaving, when we had cars over there, and sitting and watching me every minute that I was in the water. She was fearful because then there was a regular casino that was built with a swimming pool, a little more alive. And as the old Indialantic Hotel was built and winter visitors came down, it was a little more civilized.
Did you like going swimming? And
Oh, adored it, loved it. We were all good swimmers. Everybody had to be a good swimmer in those days. But I had a brother who was also a prankster, so he oftentimes led me astray in getting out too far on the ocean. I remember my mother screaming at him. But in the pools were built when the Indialantic Hotel was built, which was a lovely winter spa for the people coming down from the north. But it was an interesting life because there were so many interesting people that you met, that you were on a much more familiar basis with them because of the closeness of people that you didn't see too often.
Would you ever ride on the beach in your car?
Oh, I didn't, but my brother and his friends did. And a lot of local boys, I'm sure, did.
How far do you think they could go?
Well, you'd have to wait when it was low tide, and the beaches were firm, and they could, it might be an hour, so that they wouldn't even have to worry about where the tide was. But it all seems like a dream now. I think about it, and I think about the beaches around here now, and the difference and the availability of so many wonderful things we have. We have people who come in with lovely concerts and musical things and artwork, and it's a much more developed area. Anybody should be happy to come to Melbourne, Florida.
Yeah. Well, the space program came in the 50s, and that brought a lot of people. More to the north end of the county, I guess.
That's correct.
But some of that came down here.
Yes. So many people moved here because of it. And then they've made permanent homes since.
Yeah. You look up the beach and you don't see dunes anymore.
No.
Just big condominiums.
Oh, yes. Goodness gracious. Life has changed.
Okay. Let's see. Do you recall any famous people who came to Brevard? People that.
Well, Janet Gaynor was a movie actress at that point. Have you ever heard of her? Well, her aunt and uncle. I can't remember her uncle's name. Her aunt's name was Aunt Tilly, and they lived on the main street in a little cottage where the Bank of Melbourne is now, in that area. And let's see, besides Janet Gaynor, there were many, many people who came and went who were notably well known, but I can't think right now.
Oh, that's all
Because
right.
they probably became our best friends, and we never thought of them as being tourists.